So welcome friends from across the spectrum of hazard disciplines, practices, and experiences. My name is Carlos Martin. I'm the David Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution, as well as the Director at the Harvard University's Joint Center for Housing Studies. It is my extreme pleasure to be part of the program that Dr. Peek and the team have assembled, including introducing this panel and moderating our conversation on the Justice40 Initiative. Now, we know that Justice40 has been mentioned already quite a few times during the workshop, so it's important to define the initiative and describe its relationship to the powerful convergence of media attention, of public rulemaking, and intentional investment that is in support of people and places that have been underserved and overlooked in environmental and hazards policy historically. That is what we're referring to as environmental justice, or EJ communities today. I invite all of the participants to feel free to queue up questions in the chat. I will try to get to as many as possible as we can. But I do want to spend just a bit of time talking about this convergence, this moment that we find ourselves historically. The first day of the recent convergence, we can say, was on January 27th, 2021. And that was when President Biden signed the Executive Order 14008, which, among other actions, which was the climate action executive order, among many other actions, it created the government-wide Justice40 Initiative. So that is the effort to align federal investments with the goal of delivering 40% of the overall benefits to disadvantaged communities and to track agencies' performances toward that goal. I would be remiss if I didn't note that this moment builds off the shoulders of decades of environmental justice scholars and advocates, those in the energy justice and climate justice world, and if I may, those of us in the hazard or disaster justice space. Efforts that Dr. Bullard described in the past years, such as the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council and the White House Environmental Justice Interagency Council, are credit to these folks in the trenches as much as to the public servants we're going to be hearing about today. But practically, for today's panel, the federal initiative builds on governmental efforts from states like California, New York, Washington, and most recently Maryland to channel measurable resources to identifiably disinvested communities. More recently, we also know that FEMA has advanced metrics for social vulnerability overlaid on the agency's hazard risk maps. So our panelists today will speak to these public sector advances. The Presidential Justice40 Order, supported by the White House guidance, drafted almost exactly a year ago, set many wheels within the executive branch into motion. As cabinet agencies have responded over the following year, several questions have arisen. For example, how do the federal agencies define disadvantage, disparity, benefit, inequity, and even the fundamental concept of community itself? How can they operationalize these terms across the range of public interventions and services provided by federal dollars? And in particular, for our interests in this workshop, in hazards and emergency management in particular. And then how can they build the capacity among the grassroots civil sector entities that we know of as EJ groups to authentically participate and rigorously monitor public sector actions? These are all formidable tasks. So with that, I'm very proud to introduce this morning's panelists, federal servants who work where the rubber hits the road on the Justice40 pathway. This will not be a panel of presentations, but a discussions. We want to tap into the breadth and knowledge of our panel and hear the richness of their stories and their agency's evolution as Justice40 is implemented. So again, I would ask attendees to feel free to add your questions into the chat, and I will reserve time to bring in as many as possible into the conversation. I will prompt folks to give a few words, our panelists to give a few words on the subject that I introduce them today, starting with asking about the backstory of Justice40 in the administration's goals and how each agency has interpreted and run with these orders. First up, I would like to introduce the Honorable Director, Shalonda Baker. Professor Baker is the Director of the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity at the U.S. Department of Energy. And as I already mentioned, Professor and Director Baker was instrumental in advancing Justice40 guidance, particularly in the Department of Energy, building off of her own work and, of course, in energy justice. Prior to her appointment, she was Professor of Law, Public Policy, and Urban Affairs at Northeastern University. She was the co-founder and co-director of the Initiative for Energy Justice, which provides technical law and policy support to communities on the front lines of climate change. Professor Baker earned her bachelor's in political science from the U.S. Air Force Academy, her JD from Northeastern, and her law master's from University of Wisconsin. So, Professor Baker, Honorable Director Baker, could you describe the drafting of the guidance 1 year ago and how your agency in particular is helping to implement it?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. It's really just a pleasure to be here. I see lots of familiar names in the chat, and just want to say hello to colleagues, to collaborators, to co-conspirators. We are in a historic moment, and it is really an honor to be a part of this. And I want to echo what you said earlier, which is that we stand on so many shoulders. I mean, this environmental justice movement began about, I'm hearing a little background noise. So
yeah, I'm sorry. If somebody who, thank you, I think it's gone. Yes. I will be monitoring this. That's my job.
Monitor that. 2.5 years in, right? We're still like dealing with tech stuff, but we're standing on the shoulders of so many, and this movement really began in the late 70s, early 80s to create this moment, this historic moment that we have. So as you mentioned, the Justice40 Initiative is historic. It was a part of the climate order that was issued on day 7 of the administration. But I also want to mention the day 1 order on racial justice and equity, which is Executive Order 13985. And in that order, the president said, I want every single federal agency to examine barriers that underserved communities face when accessing federal resources. So in many ways, those orders are hand in hand. And I serve as the secretarial advisor on equity. So I led an agency-wide process at the Department of Energy to explore and examine barriers that communities, underserved individuals, underserved groups face when accessing DOE resources. I also spearhead the Justice40 Initiative across DOE, and I serve as the co-chair of the interagency working group tackling Justice40. So I'm embedded both in DOE, obviously, and also the interagency space. I want to talk about how we have been thinking about Justice40. And again, this is just by way of introduction. So for some of you listening, the whole Justice40 thing might just wash over you and you're not kind of hooked into the elements, but it's 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal and federal spending in climate and clean energy spending has to go to disadvantaged communities. So we broke that up into 3 different buckets. So first, 40% of the benefits. So we needed to determine what benefits framework made sense for the Department of Energy. The second is of 40% of the benefits of spending in certain federal climate and clean energy programs. So we needed to identify what those programs were. That's bucket 2. And then finally, in disadvantaged communities. So we needed to identify those communities. And so I came to DOE with the clothes on my back, I like to say. And so I quickly had to stand up a team to do the analysis, to engage in every single bucket that I just identified. So I did stand up a team. I hired folks from the National Lab System, people I knew who were writing, not in energy justice, which is the world that I occupy, not necessarily in environmental justice, but these were folks who were aligned with issues of equity and justice because their research had focused on issues of access to low to moderate income, access to solar, things like that. But so I also had to train those scholars and researchers on energy justice frameworks, and many of them had never worked in the political realm. So we also together were learning about navigating the political system. So I stood up the team. And then the most important thing I think I did was I stood up a Justice40 community of practice at the Department of Energy a year ago, because I will leave at some point. And I wanted to make sure that the work that we were doing at the agency would endure beyond me. And so those two things, standing up my own team, which we now have a fantastic team. Dr. Tony Reams from the University of Michigan is my right hand. He's now leading this work. And many of the folks came from the labs. Now we have permanent feds who are on our team. So the team was key. And then the Justice40 community of practice was also key. I can talk more about how we have delved into each of those three buckets in later remarks, but I wanted to just set up the framework because again, it's three kind of distinct analytical buckets, and there are political dimensions to how we do this work, as well as the sort of practical dimensions of how we actually staff it. But I'll turn it back to you, Dr. Martin.
And we will certainly be following up on some of those leads that you just provided, Director Baker. And it was very helpful for you to frame it in those buckets. And just so the audience knows, we did not plan this. We are sort of just thinking about the segues from each one. And so the second bucket is particularly helpful segue for our next panelist, talking about which programs are actually going through the piloting of Justice40 initiatives, and that is Director Angela Gladwell. So Director Gladwell serves as the FEMA Director for Hazard Mitigation Assistance, where she oversees FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assistance programs, which includes the relatively new Building Resilient Infrastructures and Communities program, the BRIC as we know it, the HMGP, Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. I almost feel like I can use the acronyms with this crowd. This may be the only time I could use these kinds of acronyms. And FMA, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. Director Gladwell also chairs the Interagency Mitigation Framework Leadership Group that coordinates mitigation and resilience efforts across the federal government. Ms. Gladwell has over 20 years of experience, including being appointed to the Senior Executive Service in 2016. She holds a bachelor's degree in historic preservation from Mary Washington College, now University of Mary Washington, and a master's in urban affairs and public policy from the University of Delaware. Director Gladwell, FEMA programs like BRIC are leading FEMA's equity efforts, including implementing some of the principles of the Justice40. Could you talk a little bit about specifics about how you're defining disadvantaged communities, engagement requirements, et cetera, in your programs?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. This is one of my most favorite events with the confluence of all of the great expertise that's here at this workshop. So it's such a pleasure to talk with you all today, and especially about this topic. I've been with FEMA for 23 years, and this to me is one of the most exciting times and transformational moments in the work that I've had a pleasure of participating in over those couple of decades. And I want to share with you some of the things we're doing in the Justice40 space in the hazard mitigation assistance programs. Before I do that, I just want to go back. I know you've heard this through other FEMA speakers in the workshop, but just to really emphasize in the broader context that FEMA as an agency has really embraced equity as part of everything that we do. We recently released the new FEMA strategic plan, which has as its first goal instill equity as the foundation of emergency management. And so to me, that's so important because it says that we as an agency recognize that underserved communities, as well as specific identity groups, suffer disproportionately from disasters. And as a result, disasters worsen those inequities already present in society. And this also to me is important because it brings people and their experiences to the forefront of the conversation on how we deliver our programs and the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And so with that, if you would humor me for a moment, I just want to share with you a personal story that helps bring this to light for me. So it's about my Aunt Sharon. My Aunt Sharon suffers from some significant health problems. She has a rare heart defect, limited mobility, and must rely on oxygen to survive. And this condition forced her to leave her job as a librarian, thus limiting her income, constraining her living conditions in a small, fairly rural community in North Carolina. If we look at FEMA's National Risk Index, she lives in a community where both the risk and social vulnerability are relatively high, and the poverty level is twice the national average. And she was impacted in 2018 when Hurricane Florence made landfall and stalled over the Carolinas for many days, causing catastrophic flooding. This is how she described it to me. When we got the sudden warning to evacuate several days into the storm, I thought I could find someone to stay with, but those folks didn't have power, and I needed some way to keep my oxygen going. The shelters were not able to accommodate my needs, and many were full by that time. I thought I would be okay. I never thought we would have to evacuate. We never have before. It was a scary time. And I tell you this story to illustrate in real terms what's at stake for people in communities across the nation, particularly in those areas susceptible to the effects of climate change. I know you all may have a loved one, a close friend, a neighbor who's been in a similar situation or is at risk of experiencing the same impacts. And they, like my Aunt Sharon, may have been more vulnerable than others due to a disability, to access to services, income, systemic inequities, or other circumstances. And then post-disaster will suffer more or longer on their road to recovery due to repeated hardships and difficulties. So I really think about them as I think about our work in Justice40. And so I just wanted to tell you just briefly about some of the things that we're doing as we are launching into the Justice40 effort. So in this first year of Justice40, we had the pleasure of having 2 programs that were part of Justice40. So I will use the acronyms after I say them again for the first time: the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program and the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. Also in FEMA, we have the risk map program, the flood mapping program, that's also a Justice40 program. And under the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have a brand new program, Safeguarding Tomorrow Revolving Loan Fund program. And we're also developing that one with Justice40 in mind. So as we are moving forward in developing, implementing Justice40, we're really moving forward in 3 ways. One, we're using competitive scoring criteria to prioritize disadvantaged communities. The second is we're addressing systemic barriers to accessing and implementing HMA programs. And then the third is we're integrating equity as part of our program outcomes and formally evaluating our progress and making adjustments. And so I'm sure we can go into some of those in a little bit more detail as we go forward, but those are some of the major ways that we're moving forward. So I can share some of those details as we move forward.
Great, thank you, Gladwell. And we will be approaching you with some of those questions as well. Both of you, Director Baker and Director Gladwell, have talked about the importance of sustaining the effort beyond your tenure and moving forward. And so there will be a lot more questions on that, not just coming from me, but I'm sure from our participants. But I'd like to turn to a representative from the agency that probably has been in this business potentially for the longest, and at least by its mandate, and that is HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So I'll be calling up Crystal Bergman, who is serving as a senior advisor for climate in the office of the Secretary Fudge at HUD. At HUD, Crystal has played a lead role in developing the department's climate plan, as well as spearheading its Justice40 implementation and its coordination efforts. Now, as a houser, I am especially pleased to see Crystal's housing creds from serving both at Fannie Mae and HUD and in DOE in multiple positions. But as an environmentalist, I also am pleased to report that Crystal has worked on both climate mitigation and adaptation in these roles. So Crystal has a bachelor's in political science from ASU, Arizona State University, that I'm sure is represented well among the participant list here today, and a master's in international policy from NYU. So, Ms. Bergman, I've mentioned that HUD's mission is inherently centered around communities, and it's statutorily charged is to support low-income households. So how much of a lift has Justice40 been for a place like HUD?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be part of this panel. I have, whether my fellow panelists know it or not, I've learned a lot from each of you in this role and previously. So I'm really excited to be here representing the agency. And I'm also, I think the more that we get to talk to folks outside of the Beltway, the better off we all are. So really excited about this panel and really happy to be here. And as you say, Dr. Martin, HUD is the agency that is dedicated to creating strong, sustainable, inclusive communities, affordable homes. So we have been on the front lines of this work for a long time. HUD has about 4.5 million public and assisted housing units. We have, through our FHA insured portfolio, we insure over 7 million single family homes, more than 11,000 multifamily insured homes. We also insure residential healthcare facilities, hospitals, and we also invest billions of dollars a year in housing and infrastructure services in neighborhoods across the country through our ever increasing role in disaster recovery and relief. So climate, energy, environmental justice is critical to the work that we do. The question, how heavy of a lift this is. Environmental justice is hard. This is hard work. Environmental justice and combating environmental racism is a heavy lift because structural racism is structural in a lot of cases, and the status quo doesn't always change on its own. So, it's hard to undo policy which historically disproportionately impacted certain groups, Black and brown communities, other disadvantaged communities. So it's really important that we get it right this go around. That said, you're right, it's a different kind of heavy lift for HUD than it is for other agencies. So, maybe comparing to, say, transportation or something like that, where our mission is dedicated to serving disadvantaged communities, and the vast majority of our programs are already kind of serving low and moderate incomes in those communities. In addition, HUD didn't receive any additional funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law. So, we don't have as much of an ability to sort of stand up new programs under this new framework. That said, we're in every meeting around the infrastructure law and partnership to say, don't forget about HUD communities, don't forget about environmental justice, don't forget about when you're spending those infrastructure dollars, that you're spending those in the communities that really matter. There are other things that we can do, and we can talk about them later too, but one of the things that we are working on improving is the ability for stakeholder engagement to be meaningful within our program. So, we developed a citizen engagement and equitable engagement toolkit through our CDBG DR program. We know that if people are at the table, their voices are more likely to be heard. So we want to make sure that we're helping our grantees bring more people to the table that haven't been heard in those places in the past. So I can talk more later on, but I'll just stop here so we can get to beyond the introductions.
I appreciate that. I think part of the challenge that I think all of the agencies are facing when it comes to Justice40 is that I think it was the first bucket that Director Baker mentioned around how to define community. So let's lean in, let's get into this a bit more, because our panel is, there are two key concepts in our panel's title, right? And that are fundamental to our discussion. One is climate and the other is race. So let's start with race by framing the opportunity and challenge of considering race within the range of disadvantages in communities and protected classes that we're talking about. I'm going to begin with Director Gladwell. FEMA now is well aware of perceptions of disparities in its services. So it's heartening to hear the enthusiasm and engagement that you and your colleagues have towards integrating equity in this conversation. And the reality is that FEMA and FIMA are hampered in so many ways statutorily. So how is FEMA leaning into this conversation on race and ethnicity in the communities you serve?
So I really appreciate the question. And, we started this effort as we move forward with one, listening. And so just having some listening sessions, just to bringing some diverse groups together, just to listen, hear, collect a lot of feedback about where we needed to go and what we needed to start with. And the second was then undertaking an equity assessment. And part of that for us is being starting to really look at where our funding is going and who it's serving, and really starting to do that analysis. And one of my goals is that we're going to be building now, as we're building equity into our program outcomes, and looking at the data to understand how we're doing, is really to move to more formalized program evaluation than we've done in the past, to be able to make sure that we have a good marker for what progress we're making, and the things that we're doing, are they helping us along that pathway, and where do we continue to need to make changes. So I think that's one piece of it. The second is, so we have a mix of different types of programs in hazard mitigation assistance. Our new one, our flagship program, BRIC, is a annual competitive program, as is the flood mitigation assistance program. And those programs really allow us to focus, again, using our scoring criteria on where we want this funding to go. And that has really been, to us, a great advantage to this. And we, in many cases, again, we're looking at where the White House is going with this and their tool, which is still in beta format, and as that gets finalized. But meanwhile, in a lot of cases, we're using the CDC Social Vulnerability Index to really help us with that, that prioritization. And we're requiring that in the application process, people are telling us about the things that matter in this space. They're telling us about the population that is impacted by the proposed project. They're talking to us about how they've engaged, excuse me, how they've engaged with underserved communities as part of the planning process and the development of the application. And so they're speaking to those things, and then we're assigning point values to those. That's going to then help us then provide some of those targeted target areas that we have traditionally not focused on before in the same way.
Thank you. We've certainly seen that kind of scoring criteria or other method in competitive grant programs playing out across a lot of the Justice40 pilot programs. So I'm going to turn to Ms. Bergman for a second, because I think part of the interesting angle when we're looking at the specificity of race and racism is that there are a lot of other ways that one can prioritize communities. Perhaps most notably has been working on issues of racism since 1968, since the Fair Housing Act. So it's not really a new portion of HUD's charge, and it's an entirely different way of thinking about race and investment. So and you mentioned already that structural racism is an issue that often is interconnected with housing, but it's a difficult one to entangle. So let's talk about programs that HUD offers, like CDBGDR, for the acronyms, Community Development Block Grant for Disaster Recovery, and other HUD programs that may be relevant in a hazards context. And how race may be playing out and addressing racism may be playing out there.
Thank you so much for the question. And you're right, race has been important to HUD policies even before we were, the Fair Housing Act, and really focusing on them. And especially when you think about the interaction with race and climate, there are big impacts. So if you see, certain neighborhoods in the same city could be 10 or 14 degrees hotter during a heat wave, because those are neighborhoods that were part of redline communities and didn't have investments, and so still to this day are, have fewer tree covers and more concrete, things like that. Those things are still happening, and we still see this impact. We also see, the COVID-19 pandemic, along with climate change, has really created a convergence of those crises and deepened some of those long-standing inequities that leave lots of Americans struggling to access affordable, energy efficient, resilient housing. And we know again that the most vulnerable, the disadvantaged communities of color are more likely to suffer and be less able to bounce back from climate change. So we're committed to tackling racism on a lot of levels. You know, the secretary in particular is dedicated and focused to this. We've got things like working on our appraisal task force to focus on reducing racism in appraisals that happen all over the country. But we're also working on things like our CDBG-DR, disaster recovery assistance, to support the most vulnerable. So as you said, the CDBG-DR is arguably the nation's largest climate adaptation program. We can argue with FEMA about the dollars, but we spend billions of dollars helping low-income communities recovering from disasters. And CDBG-DR focuses on long-term recovery efforts, helping communities and neighborhoods that otherwise might not recover due to their limited resources. So that really does target those disadvantaged communities that might not recover. Sort of a last line of defense funding that addresses unmet needs in other federal programs. So we continue to iterate and improve on this program. It's not a permanently authorized program. So it is allocated with each additional disaster. So with our most recent disaster recovery allocation, we did publish a consolidated notice that applies new requirements around ensuring assistance is targeted to those who are most in need. So this consolidated notice advances equitable distribution of assistance, including requirements for planning for targeted assistance to residents and underserved communities who've been historically marginalized. And then the notice also improves long-term community resilience by integrating resilience and planning hazard mitigation activities into the disaster recovery to reduce the future impacts of climate change and future disasters. It also requires more green recovery, resilient recovery, and green building, which is something that those disadvantaged communities are often left behind on some of those pieces.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And it's heartening as somebody who's lived in DC probably longer than he wants, to note that naming the name, touching the wound, is being acknowledged across the federal agencies. So thank you for talking about the awareness, at least, which hasn't happened in the past, of race and racism as being a factor in some of the vulnerabilities and exposures that we're talking about today. So I'm going to turn to Dr. Baker to talk a little bit about how this plays out in energy, because energy is a very different animal when it comes to race and geography. So I'm curious about how you're approaching the definitions of disadvantaged communities in relation to those demographic characteristics.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martine. I've been listening and taking copious notes because I'm just so thrilled to be on this panel. This is such a great discussion. I want to take a step back because DOE is sort of an outlier, I think, as compared to HUD and maybe closer to FEMA in some ways, but FEMA is more about reacting, right, to existing disasters. DOE, for the first 50 years of its existence, was focused solely on research and development, so solely on R&D. So imagine me coming into this agency and saying, we're going to focus on justice. You can imagine the heads of the engineers exploding, right? The scientists exploding. What the heck does justice mean? What does what I do every day matter with respect to communities and with respect to issues of racial justice, right? Like how does what I do implicate those issues? So there was a lot of education that had to go into that because, as you know, Dr. Martinez, as everyone else here on this call knows, the energy system is implicated in justice in profound ways, right? We know, based on the work of Dr. Bullard and others in the EJ movement, that the siting of hazardous facilities and the breathing in of toxins, including particulate matter, as a result of the structure and design of our energy system. We also know that EJ communities and communities of color are more likely to be paying more of their overall household income, higher percentage of overall household income to meet energy needs. That's energy burden. So the energy system is woven throughout the lives of low to moderate income Americans. It's woven throughout the lives of EJ communities, and everything we do at the Department of Energy is implicated in the EJ story. And so I want to level set, by just sort of establishing that. So there was a lot of educating that we needed to do. Fast forward 11 months to the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, which Crystal mentioned. So in November, we were all sort of, holding our hands together, waiting for this bipartisan infrastructure, or bill, as it's called informally, to get passed. That bipartisan infrastructure law allocates $62 billion in new programs to DOE. 60 new programs, 62 billion with the B, in dollars going to DOE. It is the largest inflection the largest infusion of capital in DOE since our inception. And so this was an opportunity to restructure and rewire the entire place. So the bill, as it's called, creates 60 new programs. And in all of those programs, much like what Director Gladwell is doing, we are allocating points now for justice. So this is unprecedented. Anyone who avails themselves of federal dollars, DOE federal dollars, will now have to show how they are doing right by communities, how they are not exacerbating environmental hazards and harms, how they are advancing job creation in disadvantaged communities. And again, I'm putting that in quotes because that's the language of the executive order, how they are engaging communities in profound and novel ways. And they have to show that in their application. So we've never done that at DOE. And I'm really just so delighted that we are breaking new ground in that way. Now, the types of things that Congress mandates us to do under the bipartisan infrastructure law are honestly controversial for frontline communities. So some of those things are not what we traditionally kind of put into the clean energy bucket. Some of the folks who've been working in that space were expecting more advancements on solar, more advancements on wind and offshore wind. Some of that hopefully will come through reconciliation, fingers crossed. But Congress asked DOE to lean into its R&D edge and advance things like hydrogen in a range of ways, from green hydrogen produced by clean energy to blue hydrogen to other types of advancements in the realm of hydrogen. And communities that we've heard from communities, they've said, we're not aligned with this. And so the question I have as the director charged with advancing equity through the bill is, how do we make it right? How do we ensure that we're not replicating problems of the past in the way we do business? And again, that's why we're embedding in our funding opportunity announcements this point system, 20% going to this community engagement, community benefits framework. The other major investment that Congress is making and that the American people are making in the department relates to carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Again, something that is not popular in the EJ community because in many ways it's seen as prolonging the fossil fuel industry. So we're working, again, hand in glove with the office that has been doing R&D in that space to say, how do we ensure that as we're implementing this congressional provision, we're reducing exposure to particulate matter, we're reducing exposure to NOx and SOx. That's my charge. That is the water that I carry every single day at the Department of Energy. And because we now have this incredible transformative framework for issuing funding, we are now turning to our regular programming, our appropriated programs, which is 42 billion, and embedding that in everything we do. So I am honored, like I said at the outset, to do this work. It is hard every single day because structural racism shows up in surprising ways and in unexpected ways and also in expected ways. And so it's a lot of work to do this, but again, delighted to be in partnership with so many people in the interagency who are confronting very similar issues, and we're learning from each other as we do this work.
Thank you, Director Baker. It seems like not to beat the analogy so much, but that's the voltage that you're carrying, that your wires are carrying, rather than the water that you're carrying. And so I'm thinking about that mainly because I'm thinking about that analogy that you made, rewiring how the agency currently works. And I'd like to go beyond DOE, right? Because we're talking about 3 different agencies in this panel that historically haven't necessarily always gotten along or even spoken to each other, or even known what each other's mandates are. Whereas people on the ground, regular residents in the United States have a very different lived experience where all of these things are interconnected. Robert Bullard mentioned a great example of how energy facilities in communities that are already likely point pollutant sources are further exposed to climate change effects. So if those power substations in communities that are already causing pollutants are hit by a storm, by a flood, they are going to cause more problems for local residences. They're going to damage local housing, et cetera. So there's a really important lived experience that occurs across all your agencies that it's wonderful to hear across. And certainly that brings us to the second of the two topics that are in our title, and that's the climate change, that these are interrelated, interconnected conditions that we're going to be experiencing.
And actually, Dr. Martin, you mentioned that we could jump in here.
Please
and
do.
I do want to actually make sure I answer the question on race, because the guidance that you referenced that was issued by the White House last July, we've been in this for over a year now, essentially laid out a broad framework for Justice 40 implementation. It was interim guidance. And in that framework, the White House said, every agency has the latitude to develop its own implementation process for Justice 40. And we hit the ground running. And so we developed, again, those three buckets. And in the bucket regarding disadvantaged communities, we created a map. And so that map is available on the DOE website. You can Google DOE, Energy Justice, Justice 40. And we relied on 36 data sets that have distinct sort of indicators of disadvantage. Buckets, things that you could bucket into general categories of burden. So environmental burden, energy burden, transportation burden, exposure to hazards and harms, again, relying on the great work of EPA. And again, we got the best data sets that we could find. We also looked at FEMA's data sets on exposure to climate risk. We corrected for income. And so those households have to be low income in order to fall within our broader disadvantaged communities index. But anyone can download that. Anyone can access the maps and play around with it. And that is absolutely the foundation for Justice 40 at DOE until we get a final map from the White House. And then we'll have to reconcile a little bit. But we know that the direction the White House is going is pretty aligned with where we are and that there's substantial overlap. And I don't want people to get caught up. I don't want people to get caught up in the maps, because what Justice 40 is about transformation of communities. There will be changes at the margins. There will be differences. We will debate a census tract over another. But ultimately, Justice 40 is about this narrow window where the President of the United States said, we are going to do right by the communities on which this country was built. And if we get caught up in the mapping, if we get caught up in, oh, is race a factor, is race not, then we will miss this transformative and historic opportunity to drive transformation through government programs. And so that's what I'm focused on. And by the way, on day one, I'm a lawyer, so I'm not a PhD. I said, well, how does race factor into this? And my analysts, the folks who deal with maps, they said every single map of distress in this country has the same footprint. And that's structural racism. That's structural racism. And so race is obviously still a debate that people are having in the EJ community. Should it go in? Should it go out? But let's focus on the promise of this transformative and historic moment.
Thank you. Thank you for that elaboration, and certainly that pointing out the fact that these intersections occur in the same places certainly gives us a lot of food to think about how we're identifying and I'm going to throw out another acronym there that I know is being used by DOE, the DAX, your definition of the disadvantaged communities, and people have been putting in the chat the links. As you magically say these things, they magically appear in the chat room, the various links, and so we encourage folks to check those out. So let's talk about the climate change, particularly the adaptation and the hazards fit into this conversation, because certainly we're talking about the same places, in many cases the same communities, the same households, and the same housing that is being affected, that is being exposed. They're being exposed to future hazards as well. So I will keep Director Gladwell to the end because you're specifically charged with hazards and mitigating against hazards. But let me start off with Professor Baker. And how do you think disaster justice fits into this broader vision and this moment in which we're finding ourselves for environmental justice?
Yeah. I miss being an academic and being able to talk about these things and sort of really dig in. I love this idea of disaster justice. Justice cuts across so many different things that we've been talking about, for the past 50 years, from EJ to climate justice to now energy justice and now disaster justice. And I love it all. And of course, those things are so interconnected. I'll talk about how I think about it through the lens of our key policy priorities for Justice40. So again, I'm going back to our buckets. So one of the buckets is the benefits bucket, right? And so again, I pulled together researchers. We created another working group at DOE focused on how we can measure benefits in communities. And so we looked at literature, we looked at sort of, NGO products, on how communities think about addressing how communities think about benefits and benefit delivery. And we came out with 8 key policy priorities for the Department of Energy with respect to DOE. Now, we could have had 100, right? There are lots of ways that we can think about benefit delivery. There are lots of things we could probably measure, but we wanted to keep it narrow. And this is something that almost anyone at DOE can recite off the top of their head. So one is reducing energy burden. How do we steer DOE programs to reduce energy burden? This is measurable. It's hard, but it is something we can do in terms of delivering benefits to places and measuring the impact of those the service delivery in those places. The second is hard, but reduction in exposure to environmental hazards and harms. So, obviously measuring air pollution is very difficult. EPA has been at that for a while, but we wanted to be laser focused on that. There are obvious things we can think about in delivering program benefits to communities, but we don't want to exacerbate environmental hazards and harms. We want to reduce exposure to environmental hazards and harms. We also know from the energy literature and the energy justice literature that the rollout of solar adoption in this country has been inequitable. There are a lot of reasons for that, but Black and brown census tracts routinely are not getting the same penetration of solar that majority white census tracts. That's even when you correct for home income, household ownership. And so we wanted to make sure that as we're rolling out new technologies, we're thinking about parity in adoption rates in terms of technology. You can measure that. We also know that access to capital is a problem. We can measure that through service delivery. We also know that job creation is something we should be laser focused on. That's low-hanging fruit. O&B, so the White House can tell us how to measure and track job creation through the programs that we deliver in communities. We need that steer. And we have plenty of programs at DOE that are already doing that. So job creation is one thing. And then let's talk about wealth. Wealth creation has to be a part of this conversation. We are in a wealth creation moment, right? And if things go as they have gone in the past, we're going to create wealth for a lot of incumbents, a lot of players who are already in the energy system. I'm focused on ensuring that Black and brown businesses, that underrepresented businesses create wealth and are created in this moment. And so wealth creation and entrepreneurial development is a key part. By thinking about contracts going to underrepresented businesses, we can track and trace that. And then I want to get to your point, which is the disaster justice piece. So we're focused on energy democracy, which is again, 2 words that have never been said at DOE until January 20th, 2021. This is community ownership of energy assets. That's going to create resilience. We know that from literature. We know that from the ways in which energy justice scholars have been talking about resilience in the future. So owning community assets, co-located assets, more ownership of the energy system writ large can lead to resilience. We're also focused on resilience. We know that communities of color in particular experience greater rates of outages. There's a burgeoning sort of thread of research showing us how that happens in very stark ways. So we're focused on resilience through delivery of DOE programs as well. And so those are the 8 policy priorities: embedding EJ, embedding energy justice, embedding energy democracy, and embedding this climate justice framework, thinking about resilience, thinking about disaster justice as well, which has to be a part of the overall conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you for reminding us to keep our eyes on the prize. I think too often we focus on output and output measurement, and we haven't thought about the disparities in those outputs, but certainly keeping our eyes on the outcomes, what happens to households financially, their health, their well-being, I think is ultimately the charge for all of federal government for and of the public sector in a democracy writ large. And so thank you for that. And and certainly there were a lot of conversations yesterday about data and the limitations of data that we have right now to be able to measure these. So I'm sure that'll come up in our conversation today too. But I want to talk a little bit about early on in the process, and you talked about this a little bit, Director Baker. But I may turn to Ms. Bergman around the idea of having communities actually participate in the planning for themselves. So in addition to looking at the outcomes and outputs, looking at that stages of how these communities have been denied even being involved in their processes. So you mentioned, I'm going to bring you back to this, the Citizen Participation and Equitable Engagement Toolkit that have produced this year. Could you describe that a little bit more? How does that actually change transform the process by which HUD is looking at equity issues in general and race in particular?
Sure, thanks so much. And I put a link in the chat actually to the HUD Exchange site, which links to many resources, including the Climate Citizen Participation Equitable Engagement Toolkit. So this toolkit was not developed in response to Justice40, but it is responsive to the aims of Justice40. It's a resource to aid CDBG DR, the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Grantees, in centering equity in disaster recovery programs through enhanced citizen participation. So the goal is to provide residents that are low and moderate income residents in particular in communities that receive CDBG funded the opportunity to really actively participate in the planning, the implementation, the assessment of the programs and projects, so that we don't have just our Block Grant fundings go to the same set of people and priorities that it always has. So, and this is a piece of kind of our larger climate action plan, which I'll just mention a little bit more specifically. Last November, HUD released a climate action plan that focuses on adaptation, resilience, also greenhouse gas reduction, with an environmental justice focus across all of it. And a lot of that work is focused on mapping, measurement, data. We can't manage what we can't measure. But it is also focused on more equitable disaster resilience, making sure that we get our funds to the communities that need them. But also, if we're able to stave off some of these worst impacts of climate change, we still have a window to do that. And we know that, we want to make sure that the communities and the households that we serve are not sort of left behind by this energy transformation. So looking at energy, green building, electrification, decarbonization, and doing so in a way that is equitable, that increases health for residents of those homes, and doesn't increase costs. Along those same lines, we're also looking at climate-related financial risks. So as part of another executive order, HUD is working with USDA and VA and thinking about what are the climate-related financial risks to the portfolios of our mortgage portfolios, and thinking about where do those financial risks come into play as we get more and more climate disasters, and then thinking about, okay, once we've identified those risks and what they are, how do we mitigate them and ameliorate them? The tricky part then is how do we make sure that mitigation and amelioration of those risks doesn't then fall on the backs of those same communities that are feeling the worst impacts from climate change. So if we're making changes to our mortgage policies, et cetera, how do we do that in a way that is not further disadvantaging those communities, that were stuck in those places to begin with because of their disadvantages? So those are some of the things that we're kind of thinking about holistically in terms of climate and disaster recovery.
Thank you. And it's a formidable challenge. I said this at the beginning of our conversation, that really inscribing a new principle to all of your programs is the transformation, and which is why I think it's important for us to remember that this is a moment that we're capturing in time as part of this discussion. So, and the question of the segment was around hazards and emergency management. And clearly, Director Gladwell, this is your job. you eat and breathe trying to figure out how to mitigate from future hazards, and as well as work with your colleagues throughout FEMA about hazard preparation. So I want to talk a little bit more about this question about data, because it came out repeatedly yesterday, and sort of how I mean, FEMA and FIMA have collected lots of data. You have a lot of data around your NFIP policyholders. You have data around IA applicants, et cetera. How does this play out for you? How can data from across the federal agencies be supportive of the work and your new goals for your programs?
Yes, it's a great question, because you're right. We are often swimming in data, but I think, again, we've got to link that to the decisions that we are trying to make, that communities are trying to make, and be able to bring that forward in a way that people can sort through it and understand, okay, what does this mean, and why is this important? And so for us, for a grant program perspective, we're thinking about how we look at risk data together with data about the people that we are serving, so that we can look at these things together. Because again, when we look at the two goals of our strategic plan, equity and leading the nation in climate resilience, the nexus really comes together again, where there are a set of people that are suffering more than others from disasters. And so we need to then be able to bring those data sets in a way together in a way that we can understand that. We can figure out then how we use both of all of that information to then prioritize where we're making those investments. FEMA's National Risk Index is one way that we're starting to look at this information together. But from my perspective, that's kind of where we're headed next. As we continue to evolve the Justice40, we're looking at that together with the risk information. Now, that need is much different for other stakeholders. Again, from communities, they're really looking at planning, land use planning, building codes, all of those things where they need to focus on system-based mitigation solutions. And so they need to see that data and information a little bit differently to inform those decisions. So, I think that's a big focus for us. And then, from a climate perspective, also is that we then need to really just evolve our programs in terms of what we're funding and how we're helping to tee up what those solutions can be to address climate resilience. And so this is a big area of focus for us to be able to say, our traditional mitigation projects are not meeting the needs that communities have right now. And so how can we, one, evolve what our program's doing and what we're funding and what we're holding up as examples for communities? And also, how do we take a more community-centered view of how we're actually delivering those programs, not only us in the agency, but with the other funding that's available through the various other federal agencies and through the many partners that are willing and able to step in and say, I can help. And how do we bring those partners together in the right way? That's a big focus for us.
And just the idea of being able to share and collaborate across federal agencies, I think is a huge step forward, where traditionally we've only viewed emergency management as being within FEMA's role, even though we know HUD has been in the business for at least 30 years. And every agency has some part of these kinds of appropriations. So having that ability to share data, let alone principles that guide the conversations around those data, I think are a huge step forward. We've talked about Justice40, the story behind Justice40 and how it's been implemented. We've talked about how race specifically fits into that. We've talked about the hazards within Justice40. So I'm going to start turning to public Q&A. It won't surprise you that there have been a lot out there. There's one big question that has been repeated in many ways that I'm going to hold off on. So all your participants, I just want to push a little bit more on this interagency collaboration. One more question that has come in to me individually before I ask that bigger question. So, and that's really around, if we're talking about interagency collaboration, the federal government is not an island. There are state, county, and local governments. This kind of came into question. That was addressed regarding CDBG-DR eligibility. But it's around how Justice 40 is being interpreted by your grantees. Certainly those that are applying to competitive grants are going to try to get as many points as they can in their scoring. For those formula grantees, we're talking a different story. I mean, certainly you saw after IIJA, I prefer to call it by its full name, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, rather than any DC overlay, disclaimer overlay, that there are several states that refer to it as potential social engineering, right? Using that explicit language about social engineering. So if you could talk about your relationship with the states, particularly giving good examples of how some states have stepped up to the plate, how some municipalities have stepped up to the plate, and are inscribing the same logic of Justice 40 within their applications to your programs. I'm gonna, whoever wants to take that one first, I'm happy to pass it over.
Yeah, I can start. I have learned so much in 18 months, 19 months in the federal government, and cannot even hold a candle to what I'm sure Director Gladwell knows and has been, working with for so many years. But just by way of review, we know that there are competitive dollars that go out the door, and I'll speak specifically to DOE, but this is pretty consistent across the federal family. So there are competitive dollars that go out, and then there are formula dollars, right? Mandated by Congress. We have some discretion at the agency to develop the formula. And so we had to think about those two sort of ways that funding gets out the door separately. Back to the rewiring conversation. So on the competitive side, the first thing that goes out is a notice of intent to issue a competitive award, right? And so those tend to be fairly light. This is DOE speak. So those tend to be fairly light, maybe 2 or 3 pages, but we started to plant flags in those notices of intent to say, you're on notice that justice will be a part of any competitive award that you seek. The next stage is a request for information. The agency asks stakeholders questions. Usually it's through, it's published in the Federal Register, and stakeholders from the public sector, the private sector, to academics will respond to this request for information and submit their comments to the agency. We've begun to plant flags in those requests for information. How should the agency design its competitive awards to ensure that justice is advanced, to ensure that developers, that grant recipients are not exacerbating environmental harms, right? So we started to plant those flags. And then finally, the funding opportunity announcement is issued, the competitive award, which is what we've talked about already. And in that, I mean, it's again, breaking new ground. We have the point system for community benefits and community engagement. And so that's the cycle on the competitive side. On the formulaic side, it's a little bit more constrained. And so this is where money goes to states, right? Sometimes it's a population-based formula. Sometimes another factor or feature gets woven into the formula. And so this is where we've been doing some of our hardest work in terms of figuring out how to steer those formula programs to really advance equity. And ultimately, we're about to roll out and announce all of our Justice 40 programs. So we have over 150 programs across DOE representing, billions of dollars that we're going to release publicly. And we're also going to release companion guidance with that. So companion guidance for formula, companion guidance for for competitive dollars to help states and the private sector, frankly, think about how they maximize benefits for communities. So the guidance is one thing, but then it's a lot of hand-to-hand, let's say, technical assistance that we're working, we're doing work with states. We're working with NASIO, which is a National Association of State Energy Officials. We're working with NARUC, which is a national regulatory body working with commissioners. So we're tapping into every network. Yesterday, our team met with Evergreen Action, which was an outgrowth of Governor Inslee's presidential bid. So community folks we're working with. But in my mind, the only way we're going to crack this code is by setting policy tables in states that are convened by a trusted partner, where we have agencies at that table as well, but we also have state energy, transportation officials, housing officials talking about their vision for community. Because climate, even though we're siloed, an individual experiences climate in an intersectional way. And so we need those tables to be set. I think we need philanthropy to help set some of those tables. We need NGOs to help set some of those tables, to do charrettes, honestly, to think about what the future of a community will be, because the spending that we have through IJA is going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. So we do have a little bit of a runway. The competitive and formula money is coming out now, but there's still a graduated process. And so we need communities at the table now to begin to collaborate in that way. And I did see someone's question in the chat about what social scientists can do, which is like always a lovely question. You can be a part of the table. You can also help to do the evaluation work that Crystal talked about, right? If you can't measure it, you can't move it. We need to know how we're doing, and we need you to shine a light on the shadows, right? And really help us understand how we can maximize benefits to communities. So that's my ask. It doesn't mean you stray from your research agenda. Maybe you're just steering it in a way that helps us do a better job.
Great. And thanks for answering that question before I have to pose it. I do want to give Director Gladwell and Ms. Bergman a chance to answer about that relationship with states, if you'd like.
I'll just jump in quickly. States and cities are so critical to our work, especially on our disaster recovery. The grants flow to states and to cities. And we set some parameters, we set some requirements and suggestions in some cases as well, guidelines, but it's really up to the states and the municipalities and the cities to develop their plan. And so we want to make sure that as many people are at the table as possible developing that plan, that we have as much technical assistance helping get that plan be a good one that meets the needs of the people in that state and then the vision of that entity. But there are limits to what we can do, at HUD and in the federal government. So certainly encourage, any of you in your local areas to make sure that you're engaging with your states or with your municipalities as they're thinking about what to do with those federal funds. Not just our CDBG funds, but as Dr. Baker said, the many billions of dollars that are coming through infrastructure. We want to make sure that HUD communities are at those tables, but we also need help from the communities to stand up too.
Thank you. George Gladwell.
So I certainly agree with everything that's been said. I think for FEMA, one of the things that's been helpful here is that we do have the strategic plan, which again is kind of setting a vision for emergency management nationally in addition to the agency. So to me, it's not just about a specific program going to the state and say, how can we work with you on prioritizing this? It's how do we build equity into all that we do, and how do you as a partner help us achieve that goal? One of our specific strategies in the mitigation and insurance space that we're focused on is aligning with states and tribes on priority mitigation investments. And this really opens the door, I think, for this conversation that, Shalonda, that you were referring to about having that convening at the state level that can really bring the right partners to the table and say, what are our priorities? How do we align on that? So then we can bring our programs that are not competitive, like the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is post-disaster funding, into the mix. And then also recognizing that there's other interdependencies that we can really utilize there as well. All of the projects that are submitted for FEMA, they need to comply with and be part of a hazard mitigation plan. And so as we are building equity into mitigation planning and that broader comprehensive planning, that then helps inform and tease up the projects that are going to meet these Justice 40 goals.
Thank you. So it sounds like all three of your agencies, as well as so many other agencies, are really trying to build the grassroots to protect the grassroots, knowing that in many places that we were working with across the country, there may not be the same approach to Justice 40 or even appreciation of it. And I would be remiss if I didn't close this segment of our conversation without mentioning that the governor that I mentioned that referred to Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act as social engineering, used her American Rescue Plan funds to build prisons. So these are sort of the challenges that you all face at the federal government level. And the bigger one is the big question, and then people are getting angry with me in the chat for not asking this. So this is the big question. What's next? How do you sustain this beyond your tenure in your positions in the federal government, as well as beyond this administration, potentially earlier in this administration that some would prefer to see? So who wants to take that on? I know Director Baker mentioned sort of how you're embedding this, how you're inscribing this in so many of the program scoring criteria, et cetera, but what happens next? Nobody wants to answer that one.
I'm happy to. I'm sorry. I'm happy to chime in and start the conversation. I mean, I really think it's from my vantage point, it's about making it so integrated that it's then challenging to go back, right? So we're not just talking about, changes to prioritization criteria. That's one piece of it. Again, we're building it into the planning requirements. We're looking at, and there are legislative pieces to this. For example, for us, the cost share is a major barrier. And so we've had some legislative changes, for example, that has helped us increase the cost share to be able to address some of those barriers. And other legislative changes as well that we continue to try to inform. But then again, we're baking it into our program outcomes. What is it that as a program we are trying to achieve, and integrating that into the way that we deliver, so that as we move forward, this is not just an initiative, an administration initiative that we're advancing, but it's so integral to the way that we do business. That's not to say that certainly that there aren't risks there, that pieces of that can be changed, but right now that really is our approach to this. And again, I think from a cross-political conversation, I think everyone agrees we want to reduce disaster suffering. And if we really bring it back to the problem that we're trying to solve, and these are the ways that we're trying to solve it, then it really does cross political boundaries.
That's a brilliant way of putting it, Dr. Gladwell. Actually providing services to people who need services. One would assume that that's the goal of government. Crystal.
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly here to say, that I, for a long time before coming back to government in this administration, was a career employee at HUD through several different administrations. And I saw firsthand what happens when you've got bright new shiny things that don't embed themselves in the programs, and then they go away, for better or worse, when the champions of those things go away. And so one of the driving reasons that I took this role is because I both saw the existential urgency of the moment related to climate, related to environmental justice, and the need to make sure that urgency is paired with a knowledge of how do you actually embed that in the programs. And it's how do you write the notice of funding? How do you work with agency partners to actually do the boring meat and potatoes? But it's also philosophically, how do you embed it? Thinking about, if a affordable housing property is thinking about how to ensure their property is resilient to different hazards. That shouldn't be a political boutique, flash in the pan consideration, but helping people understand that that is something that's foundational to their business as well. So it's kind of and I found a lot of common ground across agencies and a lot of other people that are working on the same thing, but harnessing that visionary urgency leadership, connecting it to the on the ground knowledge of how to get things done, and then sort of philosophically ensuring that people who are the recipients of the funding or doing the work actually really feel that this is important to their everyday.
So I'll jump in. I'm in total alignment with what both of my co-panelists have said. And I think I'll summarize it in 3 bullets, and then I also want to share something more radical. So programs, policies, and people, right? We're going to embed this in every program in terms of the way in which we issue funding, and that will have a ripple effect, right? And it'll become the baseline, and we've already done that at DOE. So now it's sort of a rebuttable presumption. You have to rebut the presumption in order to deviate from the floor that we've set. So that's programs. It also connects to policy. I mean, we have obviously a Secretary of Energy who's forward leaning on this stuff, but it will just become a part of the fabric. I'm not naive. I know that there will be many who can't wait for me to leave and can't wait to change it up. But it is the law of the land here at DOE, and it is a part of equity as a North Star. Justice is also a part of our framework. And so those are part of the standard policies of DOE. And then I am building the fiercest team in my office that I can. And so I'm building a team of career feds who are going to outlast me, who are trained on issues of EJ, on issues of environmental energy justice. And it will be a legion of folks who will support all of DOE in this work. And my office was formed coterminous with the Department of Energy, but it was never staffed. So just like the Office of Public Participation at FERC, for those of you who follow energy stuff, my office similarly was never fully staffed to live into the statutory mandate. So programs, policies, people. But the radical thing is that I'm going to change industry. You have no idea how many people call me every single day and want to know how they can be in line with DOE's policy priorities and the administration's policy priorities. I have the Edison Electric Institute, which is the overseeing body of all of the investor-owned utilities in the country. I have NARUC, I have NASIO, I have all of these major players in the industry wanting to know how their constituents can participate. And so that changes industry. That's harder than anything. Once the market moves, that's harder to unwind. So if we get the market playing, if we get big players like GE, like all of our investor-owned utilities, like Google, the Googles and the Apples of the world to move in this way, it doesn't matter whether I go away, because they then have changed the market and are creating new ways of doing business. And we're the tip of the spear in terms of putting out funding opportunities that GE and IOU, investor-owned utilities, will apply for, but that will create, I think, a ripple effect throughout the market. I'm not naive. I know that that's still hard, but the radical proposition is that if I can change industry, that's a snowball that will roll long after we leave.
Wow. Amazing responses to a very polemic question. So I thank you all for being willing to take that one. And certainly it's the challenge of our time, right? You all are building up these systems. You're going up a very hard and swift learning curve to build these programs up in your agencies. And the evidence of your efforts is going to be felt ideally sooner rather than later, so that it provides evidence of the importance of, to paraphrase Director Gladwell again, providing services to people who need the services. And so this focus on Justice40 has been a wonderful conversation. I do want to give you all an opportunity to just do a quick closeout with any final thoughts. There are a gazillion questions that have come in. I'd like to think that I summarize them as well as I possibly could, particularly around the question of the sustainability of the Justice40 initiatives. But Let me go one by one to put you on the spot. If there are any closing comments, let me ask this as your recommendation to the attendees, knowing that the attendees are scholars, or emergency management practitioners, and activists that are likely supportive of Justice 40 and its long-term goals. What would you do to tell them to keep the fires burning? I'm going to pass it first to Ms. Bergman.
Thank you. You know, we've heard a lot of really great call to action from my fellow panelists. I'll just say, you know, like I said at the beginning, this work is hard. We don't always get it right, as you know. The federal government doesn't always get it right. So I just would continue to ask you to please, you know, reach out, push us on things, respond when we have notices or requests for information. Help us get it right, because we know that we can't do it without you.
Great advice, and practical as well. Director Gladwell.
So there are people that are participating today that have greatly influenced my thinking, and especially on this topic. And I'm indebted to you all for that and what you shared with us, whether it's through direct engagement or otherwise. And we really need that as we move forward. You know, again, I don't want to repeat what was just said, but again, this is hard. It's exciting and it's hard. And we are going to mess up and maybe sometimes not make the strides that we need to. But we need to learn from you in some very deliberate ways. And, you know, we're accountable to you. You share things with us that we might not have thought about before and that we need to think about and consider. And we very much value that. So please keep pushing, keep asking us what we need and what we need to learn. It is our relationship between the research and the practitioners that really helps us move forward together. And so we just want to continue that. And I really appreciate all the work that you're doing in this space, because it's making us better and it's making us better public servants. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Director Gladwell. And I should note, it is hard work, but you three have taken it on. So to that, we thank you. And I will certainly, last but not least, speaking of hard work, I'm gonna give the Honorable Director Baker the final comment.
Well, thank you. I have a practical suggestion and then something hopefully that people can think about beyond today. I mean, one, on the practical side, we need thinkers like the people in this room to be on our merit review panels. So in order to achieve the goals that we set out in our application frameworks, we need folks who are reviewing applications with a lens to actually deliver, and they're going to go back to these applicants and hold them to higher standards. So find out how to get on merit review panels, whether that be DOE, whether that be FEMA. It's a service. So I'm asking for more service from those who are already doing service, but please, please, please reach out. We want you to be in the queue so that you can be a part of the review process. Something else though, is that I am not naive. The system that we are operating within was created over 400 years, right? Every single brick of structural racism and structural inequality was put into place over the last 400 years. I am not naive in thinking that I alone, or even the team that I build, or any of us on this panel are going to break down those walls and dismantle that 400-year system. However, I know I don't know all the people on whose shoulders I stand, but I know that someone, maybe one of your students, maybe your children, will be standing on my shoulders after this. And so we all have to keep our eyes on this broader prize. I think we're in for some hard years ahead, but we have to stay focused and know that we're all working for you. So I imagine that someday in 30 or 40 or 50 years, there is a young Black queer woman like myself who is standing on my shoulders doing this transformative work and actually winning the last brick right? Knocking down that last brick. And so keep the faith, know that we are fighting every day, keep the feedback coming, and be a part of this. So thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this conversation.
The feels. So practical and visionary. You three have been amazing panelists. You've given us really heartfelt comments and very useful ones. So on behalf of everybody who's listening, I want to thank you. And to the Justice40 Initiative, we wish you all Godspeed. I'm going to pass over the mic to our fearless workshop coordinator, Dr. Peak. Thank you all for your time.
Dr. Carlos Martin, you have been working for months to bring this extraordinary panel together. And as no one knows better than you, how hard this has been to get these three extraordinary thinkers, leaders, civil servants into this room, because Shalonda and Angie and Crystal, they are in demand. And thank you for everything you did to Shalonda, Angela, and Crystal. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, insights, passion, compassion, and your service with us. And thank you to the audience for your time, attention, and care. I'm going to just take these last 2 minutes to make a few announcements. But as I do, thank you for continuing with this torrent of gratitude into our chat box. And so I'm going to share my screen right now and just share a little bit about what is to come throughout this special day today at this workshop. And thank you for setting it off so beautifully. And so first and foremost, to everyone out there, if you have not yet responded to the one question, 1 minute, please go to hazards.colorado.edu/form22 and take a minute to answer the question on the form so the multi-talented Elise Birnbach can build out our community mural for this year's Changing Climates Focused Hazards Workshop. Also, we're going to have a break for the next 30 minutes. After the break, we're doing something new at this year's workshop. We're offering 3 community forums that are going to be focused around 3 pressing issues and topics that we have heard from our hazards community that you want to talk about. So please, after your break, come back ready, rejuvenated, ready to engage around the topics of data-driven approaches to understanding disaster vulnerability, justice-driven housing recovery, and engaged communication. And we're really excited for these sessions. So come back with us at 10:30. Then after those community forums, we're going to have just a short break. We hope you'll go grab your lunch or a snack. And we're going to have our career Kickstarter backed by popular demand and led by Lindsay Davis and Jocelyn West. If you're seeking a job, have a job to share, or if you just want to hear our 2 great speakers, Michael Byrne and Mosey London, join us for what promises to be an incredibly inspiring lunch hour. And then throughout the day today, please, please, please go to the Meet the Editors tab and the posters tab. We had great sessions last night, but all of those materials are available today and tomorrow. And people put so much time and effort and thought and care into their posters and editors page. So please leave a comment, leave a question throughout the day. And last but not least, it's now 10 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. We have 30 minutes for a break. Please have a great break, and we'll see you at 10:30 a.m. for the community forums. Thank you again to our extraordinary opening panel, and thank you to all of our participants. We'll see you in 30 minutes. Thank you.